My name's Adrian, one of the team here at Northside. So glad that you could join us online. Now is a good opportunity for you to go and get a coffee, get settled, or a few minutes off the sermon. We're going to get started straight after this worship song. See you soon.
Something's broken, I need your help. I can't fix this on my own. My heart is prone to wander far, but you call me back to your arms. And I fall at your feet again. Here's my heart again, Lord, I am yours. And I run with my chains undone, all because the love that you have shown. When I hear mercy calling, it's at your feet I'm falling. Oh Jesus, I surrender all. I surrender all to you, yes. 'Cause your kindness leads me to the light. No fear, no shame, I can't hide. You bore the nails and you wore the scars. Now I am safe in your arms. Oh, and I fall at your feet again. Here's my heart again, Lord, I am yours. And I run with my chains undone, all because the love that you have shown. When I hear mercy calling, it's at your feet I'm falling. Oh Jesus, I surrender all. You deserve it all. I surrender all. To Jesus I surrender, humbly at your feet I bow. And these earthly treasures all forsaken, here's my life, I lay it down. Oh, to Jesus I surrender, humbly at your feet I bow. And these earthly treasures all forsaken, here's my life, I lay it down. Oh, and I fall at your feet again. Here's my heart again, Lord, I am yours. And I run with my chains undone, all because the love that you have shown. Oh, and when I hear mercy calling, it's at your feet I'm falling. Oh Jesus, I surrender all. Oh Jesus, I surrender all.
Well, let's just call it as it is. Worshipping to a screen is a bit weird, especially when the faces are not familiar to you. And so one thing that's been a great gift to us as a church is to give our worship team a much needed break. They're one of the hardest working teams within the church as they volunteer hours and hours and hours each week to put a service on for us. And so one thing that we've been really intentional with this during this time is to give them a break, to let them rest a little bit. But one thing that's been very exciting is they've wanted to be a part of it more and more. And so behind the scenes, we've been working out the logistics of how that can happen. And one thing I'm very excited to announce is that this week we're going to be gathering as a team to record some worship for us. Familiar faces singing songs that you know. And I'm hoping that this time next week we will have those familiar faces on the screen once we get through the edits and all that needs to happen. And so hang with us. We know it's an odd time in the life of the church, and as we adapt, everyone has been doing the same. But one thing I can assure you is that the heart has remained the same behind the scenes. That we want to bless you, to honor you, to gather together and to worship our good God as one church. And so hang with us whilst we get that organized for you. We're in week 4 of our 5-part series, Anchor Points. This week we are talking about the fact that God is in control. I'm sure it's going to be a challenging message to hear, but also a very encouraging message to hear. So hang with us as Pastor Sam brings us that message today.
Got through life, didn't get to church all that much, but as much as I could. Joined every boys' rally that was a little bit closer to the Christian faith. And then joined the service, the Navy first off and that, and then I actually served a couple of services at sea, etc. for that. Then on land and different bases. My military life and that did help me out a bit. Then a section of the military life around the Vietnam War, I totally lost it. Basically, then I came home to Australia. I went to see Father Sliney, and I was a bit cut up at the time, in the January of '70, and he said that I was a murderer, I'd never be forgiven, and there'd be no salvation for me. And he told me to leave at Holland Park. I sat outside, and Father Casey just pointed out, and Sister Narcissus and Sister Tarcisius and Sister Helen just told me to go. So I left. And I tried shooting myself, and that jammed. Just gave up after that. My life is changing for the better. I've felt it. I feel like I'm forgiven and I've salvation. I firmly believe, right, the big fella up there has actually put me through hell. Then he introduced me to a church. Then he introduced me to another woman that would raise me up further, which in turn introduced me to all you guys. And I feel saved, I feel a lot better. And I just really want to get stuck into even just feeding the people at Alpha.
Good morning, Northside. Sam here. We continue week 4 of our Anchor Point series this morning. And we're going to read from 2 verses, 2 passages, Ephesians chapter 1, verses 11 to 14, and then a very well-known passage from Romans chapter 8, verse 28. From Ephesians 1, verse 11, "In him we were also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will, in order that we, who were the first to put our hope in Christ, might be for the praise of his glory. And you're also included in Christ when you heard the word of truth, the gospel of your salvation. When you believed, you were marked in him with a seal, the promised Holy Spirit, who is a deposit guaranteeing our inheritance until the redemption of those who are God's possession, to the praise of his glory." And now from Romans chapter 8, verse 28. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." For those of you that have grown up in the church like I have, at one point or another, you might have sung a song that went like this. He's got the whole world in his hands. I'm not going to sing it for you this morning. In fact, it's one of those tunes that I'm sure you're already singing it out loud or in your head this morning. He's got the whole world in his hands. And we truly believe that as kids growing up, right? There is a childlike faith in all of us that God does have the world in his hands. And yet there comes a point in our life where we begin to think, really? Does he? As a pastor, I can understand this. I get this because over the years you start to see the stories of people who've had kids and they discover that they've Down syndrome or some sort of challenge that they need to work through in life. You deal with people who've had loved ones involved in car accidents or terrible tragedies in their life. You sit with people and you hold the hands of people who've been through open heart surgeries. And certainly in this period, just this week alone, I've talked with and I've sat with people that have heard that phrase, I'm sorry, but your job is no longer, or we don't need your services anymore. People who are dealing with the horrible news of sickness in their life or in the life of family members. Oh, he's got the whole world in his hands, right? And yet, one of the things for me as a pastor is that you see these people who are hit with these challenges and this chaos and this disorder in their lives, and yet still come through all of this with an incredible sense of stability in ways in which their faith almost seems bigger after the fact than it was before when it first started. Would you like to have that sort of resource in your life? That's what we're going to look at this morning, because when I think back on these dear friends that I do life with, I believe most of them have this anchor point. Now remember, we've been talking about this series, anchor points, the attributes of God. They're anchored to this attribute of God that we're going to talk about this morning. And remember, I said scientifically the role of an anchor is to transfer the stability of something that is beyond yourself into your present swirling circumstances. And so we've talked about the anchor points, the attributes of God that Christians anchor themselves to. That God is faithful, that God is loving, that God is knowable. And this week, here is this anchor point that I think has gotten so many of us that call Northside home and that call God Father, this anchor point that has gotten us through these challenges in life. And here is the anchor point. Ephesians chapter 1 verse 9 says, "In him we are also chosen, having been predestined according to the plan of him who works out everything in conformity with the purpose of his will." Here's the anchor point. God is in control. God really does have the whole world and the whole universe in his hands. That is the truth that mentally we need to assent to, that everything that is happening now, everything in our life circumstance, everything this passage of Ephesians says is happening in accordance with what the Greek says is his plan, his purpose, his bulo, his blueprint. He's working all of that right now. He's working it all. He's got the world in his hands. To which, wouldn't it be great to say, hey, yeah, God's got it all in control? Great, that's fine. Fantastic. See you next week. But naturally, a range of emotions and a range of questions begin to rise for us. And the natural question for us is this. Hang on, if everything is within God's control, then what happens to our free will? And before I go down a rabbit hole of questions that Christians have been debating for thousands of years, let's look at the real problem that we face in this. What happens to free will and responsibility? And the first point that we've got to remember with this is who us is. See, when we ask this question, we've got to remember us. And us is Western, highly individualized, post-enlightenment, self-focused people. Western thinking is different from the Bible, is either or. Or let me put it a different way. In our Western thinking, we think when it comes to personal responsibility and choice versus determinism, we think it's either Macbeth or McFly. Macbeth or McFly? You see, on one hand, there's that thinking. Remember Macbeth, when shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain, when the hurly-burly's done? The tragedy of Macbeth is that Macbeth's life eventually turns out to the fulfillment of the prophecy of those witches at the beginning of the story. In other words, there is people who have a Macbeth-type thinking, which is fatalism, that if God is in control, then everything is sealed. It's fate that your decisions don't matter. On the other side of the spectrum is Marty McFly and Back to the Future. You know that moment where, of course you'd know this moment, you love this movie. I love this movie. That moment where Doc has come back from the future to say hi to Marty, and Marty says to Doc, Doc, what does my future look like? Is it a good one? And Marty says Doc says to Marty, your future is whatever you make it, so make it a good one. And so that's the other way that we often think, that in our free choice determines our future. It's either fatalism or determinism. And it's either Macbeth or McFly for us Westerners. Here's the thing. The Bible never talks in those terms. The Bible's actually not either or. The Bible is both and. And if you want some proof as to how that works, you look at passages like Proverbs 16, verse 9, where it says, in their hearts human beings plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Hear that again? In their hearts human beings plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. This passage teaches us in the Bible that the Bible's view, God's plan, is that we are absolutely free, but we are also absolutely determined at the same time. Proverbs 16:33 says it as well. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And so here's what it's saying. When it says in their hearts human beings plan their course, what it says in terms of God's control is, first and foremost, your decisions are yours. Your decisions matter. Your course is your course. Your decisions are your decisions. Your consequences to those decisions are your consequences. In other words, you are absolutely free to make whatever decision you would like. But then it says, as the Lord establishes their steps, then it's really saying your plans are yours, but how these plans work out as far as all of history is concerned, well, that is up to God. Nothing that happens in all of the freedom of your choice is outside the plan of God. You are absolutely free and you're determined at the same time. How can that be, we say? And part of the reason we say that is because our classic Western either or thinking. But it's both and, that God fixes your personal decisions into a future that is according to his plan. And we go, well, how does that work? The best way I could describe it is God sent a great prophet back in the 1960s that showed us Australians how this really works. The prophet's name was called Mr. Squiggle. If you hadn't seen Mr. Squiggle, the way Mr. Squiggle worked, this great prophet, is that 3-year-olds would send into Mr. Squiggle a blank canvas with a few scribbly, ugly black marks on it. And Mr. Squiggle would ferret away with his pencil-like nose over the top of these black marks. And at the end of all of this ferreting away, he would exclaim, "Upside down." And then we would turn the canvas over. The host of the show would turn the canvas over. And what looked like ridiculous, unrecoverable black marks on the canvas had suddenly been turned into a beautiful artwork. Here's the point. God is the ultimate Mr. Squiggle. And you and I know and we sense that there are black marks, there are things in our life that we think are unrecoverable, and there are choices that we have made, and there are consequences we have felt as a result of those choices. But the great truth of what Ephesians 1 is saying to us, that everything works according to God's will, is that there will come a point in time, whether it is at one point in your life or when you meet him face to face, that he says upside down, and those mistakes and those bad things and the pains you feel will be turned into a beautiful artwork. Now, if you want me to get quickly grounded, you can see these biblical examples over and over and over again. That's a great encouragement for us. You want some examples? Let's take Paul, for example. Acts 26, verse 32. Paul's chained up, handcuffed in a courtroom, and he appeals to King Agrippa, that he would go and appeal to Caesar in Rome. And Agrippa turns to Festus in verse 32 and says, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So pop quiz class. Was appealing to Caesar a good decision? Good or a bad decision? Well, if you read the book of Acts, well, the poor guy dies. Paul dies as a result of going to Rome. Good or bad decision? Bad decision. No, wrong. Good decision. If Paul hadn't have gone to Rome, then the gospel wouldn't have spread throughout the Western world. Upside down. Then the classic story is that story of Joseph. You know, Joseph, Technicolor dream coat, has a dream that he's better than his brothers, arcs up like a spoilt little brat, tells him smartly, tells them that he's better than the rest of them and one day he'll rule over them all. And as a result, they dump him into a hole. He gets sold into slavery. He gets accused of rape. He gets thrown into jail, rots there for years until he eventually gets plucked out. Here's the question, class. Telling your brothers that you're better than them, good or bad decision? Bad decision. No, wrong. Good decision. Because if you know Joseph's story, he goes on to be the prime minister of Egypt. And there comes that beautiful moment in that story where his brothers are finally face to face with him and he recognizes them and he breaks down in tears. And after all of the hurt and the pain that he had been through in his life, he has the wisdom to declare to them, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. What is that? Upside down? Let me move on. The only way I can really say this is that on one hand, God is absolutely fixing everything in the way that he wants to. But he's not doing it despite our choices, but he's just doing it through our choices, even the bad ones. And that is the demonstration of the sovereignty of God. I mean, the only way I could sort of think of it is that life is like a pinball machine. Your life has probably felt like a pinball machine. You go up ramps, down ramps, you get hit, you get bumped, you get put into holes, you're all over the place. But the sovereignty of God is such that there is a bias to the canvas of life. There is a bias that no matter how much you get thrown around, that your life eventually will move to that slot, to that point in which you land up in the place that is in accordance with his plans for your life. Now, some of you, if you're still with me, rightfully saying, well, Sam, that's great, and I've got a theological nosebleed now that it's both and. I'm still trying to work through how that works in my head, but the deeper question that some of you might have this morning, particularly if your life feels like God is not in control, your deeper question is, well, how is this intellectual reasoning about God's plan going to help me go through what it is that I'm going through today? The truth is God has a plan and God is in control. And the answer to that, though, is that God's control doesn't have one aspect, it has two. The first aspect is this, that God is moving us to a point, as Revelation says, where there's no more pain. But the irony of it is the road to that place where there is no more pain often goes through the pain. And isn't that how many of you feel today? And more importantly, isn't that how many of you have come to understand that as we get older, we realise that without life's troubles and without pain, we can't be people of glory and significance and weightiness. We've talked about this for the past 3 or 4 weeks. It's the Stresswood principle. Go and have a look at some of the past messages. But, can I get a virtual hands up here on our online forum or YouTube or Facebook or comment in there? Just give me an amen, give me a yes, give me a hashtag hand or whatever it might be. Help me out here, but can I have a show of hands? For some of you, over the arc of your life, have you had moments where you can look back and say, you know what, I never asked for that pain, I never wanted that pain, and life felt totally out of control then, but you know what, God did something in the middle of that. God is in control, but often the road to the painlessness is right through the middle of pain. So here's the question then, what do we do when it feels like life, and in particular God, is totally out of control? What do we do to reconcile between the intellectual truth of what we've discussed this morning, that he does have a plan, that everything is working towards his purposes, but it doesn't feel like it? Here's what I preach to myself, and here's what I wrestle through as I go through those varying moments of wondering whether or not God is in control of my life. The first thing that we need to do is you need to accept your limited perspective. For many of us, part of the pains of the uncertainty and the lack of control is that, if I'm in pain, then God can't possibly be in control. And we just need to accept our limited perspective in the situation. When I was a kid, I rolled down the driveway. I thought it would be a fun thing to do. Rolled all the way down the driveway and I smashed my head against the rock and I split my eye open. So Dad takes me down, as a little kid, 3 or 4 years of age, takes me down to the doctor. Doctor has a look at it and says, "Oh, that's going to need stitches." And he says, "Righto, Doc," and they put me there on the table. And my dad says, "Well, where's the anaesthetic?" And the doctor said, "Oh, it's only going to need 1 or 2 stitches. Giving him the stitch is going to hurt just as much as the needle for the anaesthetic, so let's just do it." And so it's at that point that my poor dad had to hold me down on the doctor's table as the doctor put 1 or 2 stitches through the side of my eye. And as Dad explained the story to me, there was no greater heartbreak for a father than to pin your little kid down and watch my eyes say to him, "Dad, what is it that you're doing to me? Why are you putting me through this pain? Why would you do something like this?" What, as a kid would think, why is my life out of control? Just because you lack the resources or the perspective to see the entire situation, look, we relate to God with the same mental capacities and wisdoms as a 3-year-old to a 35-year-old. But infinitely wider is the gap. But at the same time, I understand for so many of us in the discussions that we have, that we get that frustration and the cry of our hearts when we're in the middle of pain, where we say, "God, what are you doing in this?" Job was a great example in that. Chapter 23 of Job, Job says, "If only I knew where to find him, if only I could go to his dwelling, I would state my case before him, I'd fill my mouth with arguments, and I'd find out what he would answer me, and I would consider what he would say." In other words, if I get the chance, I'm going to find God and I'm going to give it to him. To which, God's response is startling in the middle of all of that. It's startling because you think it'd be an arm around the shoulder. "Oh, Job, it's fine. Come here. Let me give you a hug." And it's not. God's response in Job chapter 38, verse 4, he says, "Where were you when you laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know." In other words, what do you know, Job? The brutalness of that statement is part of the healing process that allows us to humbly accept our limited perspective. Just because you can't see a reason for life seeming out of controlness doesn't mean that God doesn't still have the world in his hands. We have to accept our limited perspective. Here's the second thing that I do and we must do. You've got to be willing to drop your agenda. In other words, don't refuse to imagine anything different from the current situation that you're in. In fact, in my life, so much of the anxieties and the tensions and the fear that I feel when I think that God is not in control of the world or my life comes from that expectation gap between what I feel is my agenda for my life and what actually happens. It's like trying to convince a 12-year-old who's playing his Xbox to go to Disneyland. If he's playing Xbox, you say, "Come on, hun, we're going to go to Disneyland." And he'd say, "No, I'm playing Halo. I'm not going to Disneyland. I'm in the middle of a game." To which you'd say, "No, Disneyland is so much better." And you see, when there's prior agenda, you've got to take the kid kicking and screaming off to Disneyland. If there is no game, if there is no agenda, then at the least, if you woke them up, "Come on, sweetie, we're going to Disneyland." What's Disneyland? Well, it's this amazing place you can go to. Oh, all right. If there's no prior agenda, then at the least they go off indifferent. At best, it exceeds their wildest expectations. Whenever we have an agenda as to how we think God should be in control of the world, then ultimately for us, it means that we go off into our futures kicking and screaming. We go off angry and frustrated and resentful and bitter. And I know lots of Christians that are like this. I call it the negative will of God theory. It's the Christians that say, I know I have to submit to God and life is painful and I will forever be in a state of frustration with him and it's part of my stoic duty to him. And life will never get any better than this. Come on, don't refuse to imagine anything different. Paul says, I consider that our future, our light and momentary troubles will be nothing to the future glory that we have with him. Paul imagines a different future. It's possible that God in the midst of this is working out a future that you just are refusing to imagine. Here's the last one. And ironically, this is one of our team values. And ironically, this is a great tip just for relationships, if anything. If you don't want to use it for God, then just use it for your relationships. You assume the best intentions of the other party. All sorts of studies on happy couples show that the happiest couples in life are ones who have an overly positive view or expectation of the other person. We talk about it here in terms of part of our team culture, is that we've got a commitment to just assume, when we're confused, the best intentions of the other party. And we said last week, life with God is a relationship. And so take that assumption into that relationship. If you are angry with God, if you are frustrated with God, or you don't understand God, then at the least assume his best intentions. And isn't that exactly what Romans 8:28 was that we read this morning? And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. We know that God's working for the good of all who love him. And that's not a Christian cliche. It's a declaration of God's best intentions for your life and mine. There's a principle here. It means that if you feel mad or you feel sad with God, find the most generous explanation of who he is and of his behavior and his attributes, and you believe it. God is loving, God is kind, God is faithful, God is in control. I choose to trust and believe it. Find it and believe it. Declare God's best intentions over your life. And you declare that, and as painful as this thing is, you say God is working in all things, the painful things, the frustrating things, the out of control things, the learning things, the good things, and he's doing it because he loves me and he's for me. And that's our wrestle, isn't it? It's always between the head and the heart. God is in control. That's the anchor point. But our deep wrestle is just because it feels like he's not in control doesn't mean that he isn't. You have to preach it to yourself. You have to dig. You have to discipline yourself to go through these things. You know what makes a difference between whether or not we lean into God in these out of control moments or not? More often than not, it's also the people that we have around us. Because I don't know about you, but whenever I find myself in the midst of the chaos, I'm not seeing life clearly. I'm certainly not seeing God clearly. And so you need those people who come into your life out of love and not cliche, who understand you and say, you know what? I think you need to see a different perspective on this. And it's vitally important because how many different people might you have seen over the years? People who have said things like, you know what, when I was 12, my mother died and it felt like God was not in control, and so I decided to leave him. And I've been away from him for the next 20 years of my life. Or when I was 18 or when I was 25, someone said this to me and it hurt me and I decided to ditch God. You need people to come around you and to remind you, to help you reframe and say, look, let's see this a little bit differently, not as an excuse for God, but as a way to explain that God understands this, that pain and confusion is nothing new. Jesus said, in this world you'll have trouble, but cheer up, I've overcome the world. Tragedy and pain are part of the story. God's plan is that we will move to painlessness, but the pathway to painlessness often comes through pain. And that the cross came before the crown. And that's what we see time and time again in the life of Jesus Christ. The tragedy and pain are part of the story, and he doesn't extract himself from it. Philip Yancey, a great Christian writer, said this: there's only one thing that's worse than disappointment with God, and that's disappointment without God. And that's the alternative that's before you this morning. God is or isn't in control of the world that is around you. And can I suggest to you that anyone who is a Christian is a person who has finally had the humility and the strength and the courage to come to the recognition that there is a God and I'm not it. And that they've discovered the life-giving freedom that it's a lot less burdensome to not have to try and control the world yourself and to leave it up to God. But if we're real, all of us at moments and times in our life feel like there are times when God is not in control. I think there is no greater season than what we're all going through right now. But as we finish this morning, let me remind you of this. At least he had the gumption to swallow his own medicine. At the cross, we see Jesus Christ cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The Sam paraphrase says, my God, why have you lost control of my world?" I mean, what's happening there at the cross? You know what that is? That's a cosmic stitch to the head. The cross is a father that is pinning his son down to the table and is holding him into the pain in all of the confusion that is in that moment, with a perspective that was way beyond him. And yet in Jesus Christ, we see the trust and we see the declaration of best intention that says, Father, not your will, but my will be done. That the pathway to the painlessness will come through pain. And so at the least in Jesus we see, if you are disappointed with God, or if you're one of those people maybe that are watching in and you've been disappointed with God for years, God defeats the argument that he can't possibly be in control because of the pain that we see in the life around it. He defeats it by saying, I'll enter into the pain. I'll move into that space and I'll lead you through that into the promise of my sovereignty, that I have good and wonderful plans for your life in spite of that. And such is my power. Such is my power that I can take every black mark, I can take every sting, I can make every mistake. I can take all of those things on the canvas of life, and there will be a time and there will be a day, and I promise you this, says the Lord, that you will hear my voice say, upside down. Here's the anchor point. God is in control. God is in control. God is in control. Let's pray. Father, help us this morning. Help us in our limited perspective. We would ask that your Holy Spirit would do its work now in our lives, particularly for those this morning, Father, that are facing situations. And I know that there are brothers and sisters within our church family that are in that space where they would have every right to feel like you've lost the plot, that you're absent, that you're not in control. I pray that your Spirit would do its job in helping their hearts and our hearts to feel what our head knows to be true. Father, for those of us that I've spoken to this morning and that may be watching in right now, may have stumbled across this through an internet search, may have first been introduced to Northside through this weird online forum, may they hear the heart, may they hear your heart of your desires and plans for their life. And I would pray that perhaps for some there would be a rewiring of narratives, of false truths that they've come to believe, and that this morning would be opened up the possibility that they would see that even in the midst of their disappointment, there is a place and a space with you to trust you again. For the rest of us, Father, may this be a great reminder of the inevitability of these disorienting moments in our lives. And so I'd pray that you would have sown seeds into our hearts and our soul that will be brought to mind and brought to fruition right at the right time, that there be nothing wasted in what we've heard this morning, Father. That it's part of our growth and preparation, being soaked in your word this morning. We thank you for that. We want you to use that at the time that you see fit for our lives. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm conscious that each and every Sunday we're doing communion, which if you're watching in and wondering why we do this every week, it's not just a tradition that the Churches of Christ do, our denomination, but it was really just Jesus' invitation that's been passed down by his followers year after year after year. And so I'm conscious that you might want to be thinking about preparing some form of communion each week as we have this online service, but at the least at the spiritual level, I know for many of us we find great sense of unity and connection in this season of disconnection when we partake in this moment together, either physically or spiritually. This morning as we take the bread and the cup, may this be the ultimate tangible reminder that on one hand, God himself in the person of Jesus, that Jesus in his humanity felt what you might be feeling this morning. Fear, confusion, anxiety, and doubt that God is in control of his life. May we look to the cross, to his body broken and his blood spilt, to say that God modelled to us the trust and the faith and the place and the space that there is to be angry and frustrated with God, but also to continue to trust and sit within the knowledge of his sovereign plan for our lives. Jesus modelled that God's in control, and that in this moment we might give up to him the same way that Jesus gave up and said, not my will, but your will be done. That we wait, God, to see the ways in which you are bringing your plans for our lives to fruition. Let's take communion now.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Hey, our prayer as a team, as a church, is that that these would be encouraging messages, that they would be messages of hope. But we know that sometimes the message isn't enough. Sometimes you do need some extra support. And so please get in touch with us. Hit the Need Prayer tab at the top. Whatever it may be, please reach out. We would love to pray with you, encourage, to hear your story and hear ways in which we can support you. Some really cool things happening in the life of the church. Please stay on our social media for Northside nights that we're doing. Got new content coming each week. Some great events happening with youth, some great events happening with the families, lots happening in the life of the church. One encouragement is this week to find your five. Find 5 people in your life that you can continue to build and foster a close relationship with. Go to their house, watch the church online together, do a little community group if that's what you can do. We can encourage you that with our government lifting restrictions, as we continue to go on, that smaller gatherings are okay. Larger ones are still probably a little while off, but we can encourage you that you can be face-to-face in a physical room with others. So find your 5 this week. We can't wait to share the next message, the last one in this series next week. We hope you have a great week. We'll chat soon.
Be still and know that the Lord is in control. Be still, my soul. Stand and watch as giants fall. I won't be afraid. You are here. You silence all my fear. I won't be afraid. You don't let go. sing, be still. Be still and trust what the Lord has said is done. Find rest, don't strive. Watch His faith and grace align. I won't be afraid, for you are here. You silence all my fear. I won't be afraid, you don't let go. Be still my heart and know I won't be afraid. I won't be surely love and mercy, your peace and kindness will follow me, will follow me. Surely love and mercy, your peace and kindness will follow me, will follow me. Surely love and mercy, your peace and kindness will follow me, will follow me. Surely love and mercy, your peace and kindness will follow me, will follow me. Yes, you will. Yes, you will. Your love surrounds me. Your love surrounds me. Your love surrounds me. Your love surrounds me. Yes, you are. Yes, you are here, Jesus. Your Holy Spirit is here, Lord. Yes, Jesus. You lead us by still waters, Jesus. You prepare a table in the presence of our enemies. We can sing that surely love, surely mercy will follow us all our days, Lord, for all our days, Lord. We trust in you, yes, we trust in you.